I'm Nerdarchy Ted.
I'm Nerdarchy Dave. Welcome to Nerdarchy, for nerds by nerds.
Now let's make that D20 roll and have this video succeed.
I was indulging in one of my guilty pleasures, which is TikTok, and I came across a video that kind of got me thinking about D&D and D&D combat, and kind of like how we always want things to go, but they never really seem to. And it's like, I roll a D20, I swing my sword, or it can get pretty rote after a while. But I was watching this fight choreography from Jumanji, and I was like, oh, this is so cool. How could we make D&D combat more exciting and like this?
All right, so the person behind this TikTok is the Lucy Cork.
And we'll see you on the other side. Before we jump into it, we want to take a moment to thank our sponsors, Hit Point Press and Splatterant Games, and they've got something really cool on Kickstarter right now. The Seeds of Decay, Ted's holding up. They were giving that away at PAX Unplugged.
Yeah, this is a little primer that goes through some of the stuff that's in their Kickstarter that's live right now, and there's a lot of really great, really cool stuff in this as well as within the Kickstarter itself.
Yes, I mean, Daubers has been around for a little while. It started as a tabletop game. Made by Daryl T. Jones from Splatterant Games. It's fantastic. I own it. I backed it. I played it. Daryl's a great guy. And if you're familiar with Nerdarchy, you might be familiar with his work from Out of Box Encounters. He did all the maps. So there's a Nerdarchy connection for you. There might be more coming, but I can't talk about them yet. But what you can expect to find inside is 3 modular rules systems, 4 inventions, contraptions, and foraging, 30 plus original spells, 30 fully illustrated items, 60 new monsters, create your own playable forest animal species, new character classes with subclasses, backgrounds, feats, and more. Adventure arcs spanning from level 1 to 8 with side quests, hooks, and expansive lore for an open world feel. Essentially, if you've ever wanted to play a game that's like David the Gnome or the Smurfs, any tiny creatures, that's what this is. You could totally do that.
Yeah, it's really, really great. You got to check it out. Link is going to be down in the description below.
And one of these cards up here.
Well, I imagine, if we talk about D&D a lot, not everyone is going to be familiar with the Cypher system and what those major minor effects are. So why don't we get into that first?
Yeah, so Cypher system has basically 5 special numbers on the die. There's the 1, which is like a critical fumble, which they call a GM Intrusion.
Mm-hmm.
Then there is 17, 18, 19, and 20. Something different happens every time you roll those dice. In D&D, it's just like you either hit or you miss. If you get a crit success, then if the DM uses DM fiat, something might happen, but generally you just double the damage on the dice and, roll twice. So, it's cool when you succeed with a 20, but there's no gradation and it's like an, all or nothing.
Indeed. So in Cypher system, if you roll a 17 and you're in combat, you do an extra point of damage, and 18 is an extra 2 points of damage. So in 19, this is where you fall into the minor effect, and you have some choices. You can do 3 additional points of damage, you can knock them back, you can move past them, or you can have the attack basically distract them, causing some advantage there. And then the 20 is a major effect. This is going to do 4 points. You have a choice. You can do 4 points of damage. You can knock them down. You can stun them, or they can be impaired, which is basically going to make everything they do for the rest of that combat harder.
Yeah, or even disarm them. So there's like different things. So like if you, depending on what you roll, really cool things can happen. And we mentioned like the one is a GM intrusion. That's like a fumble kind of in D&D, but that's not an actual rule. It's just that you pretty much always fail. I believe on like a saving throw or an attack roll, but not skill checks. But nothing in the rules says it does. A lot of people play, other things happen. But in Cypher system, it's actually in the rules where there's something called a GM intrusion, and the GM will decide what happens. Does your weapon break? Do you fall? Do more enemies show up? Does a loved one kind of fumble onto the scene and get in the way and fail your attack? But not only have you missed because you failed your attack, but now maybe they're in danger. So it's a very narrative tool.
Indeed. So when we look at these concepts and how they add both mechanical and narrative applications to the game, we kind of question, like, what does this mean? What does this look like if you try to extrapolate that and put that into a D&D system?
Yeah, so I started giving it some thought, and it's like, for the extra damage effects, in D&D, like 1 or 2 points is not really a big deal. It's a lot more meaningful in a system like Cypher system. So I was thinking, especially because of the way things scale in D&D. So it's like, could you replace them with your proficiency modifier, or, for a 17, 18, maybe it's your proficiency modifier or your character level, whichever is higher, right? Because that would make a big difference, right? But then, like, for your 19s and your 20s, where do you go from there? Because also, like, doubling the dice might not be nearly as big a deal as it used to be if you're adding other numbers to it, So figuring out those gradations could be fun, but it's also like the tough spot. Maybe you do the bonus damage, but for D&D you also just include the minor effect or include a major effect.
So the interesting components that you have within 5th edition is you have character level, you have stat modifiers, which that can be variable depending upon the person's play style and whatever have you. Whereas your proficiency modifier, that's a static thing. That's going to be the same regardless of this table play style versus that table's play style. And D&D is a dice, system. Like, you're used to rolling dice. Whereas Cypher system, if you're attacking with a light weapon, it does 2 damage. A medium weapon does 4 damage, and a heavy weapon does 6. So, like, those are the static numbers. And there's ways to improve those based on abilities and what have you. But for the most part, that's the kind of spectrum that you're dealing with. So when I look at a longsword attack in D&D versus a longsword attack in Cypher, I would say, as opposed to numbers, you could have dice, and maybe a number of dice equal to your proficiency modifier. So whether you want to say, okay, well, I roll 1d4 at 17 and 2d4 on an 18, that could be interesting. But when you then take that further and say, well, a 20 used to be just double the damage, it could be less, that 20 could be less than, well, if I rolled 3 additional dice, even if they're only D4s on a 19, that could be more than, I was attacking with a D4 to begin with.
And also we're talking about making combat more exciting, and doing more math doesn't necessarily always equal excitement either. No, scratch that. It never equals excitement, okay? Unless you're strange, and that's what your thing is, math.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say it's strange. And I have to say that there are times when people calculate how much damage they're doing with an attack. That can be fun, that can be exciting, but it's not always exciting, I would say. So I would then go in that kind of direction of looking at effects. Whether it's, does that open them up? Does that lower their armor class? Does that impose some kind of disadvantage? What kind of tactically can you do that helps out the party and makes the combat more narrative and more fun?
Yeah, I think effects is definitely a place to go. And there is kind of an analog in D&D that you can use that is really, really helpful because we have conditions, right? You might designate some of the conditions as valid for minor effects, while other ones are, considered your major effects. Because, paralyzing someone or stunning someone is a big deal. But also, like, and because of the way you're adding it in on crits, I would say it only lasts until the start of your next turn, right? So this way, it's not like for the whole fight. It's not as powerful as a spell or an ability per se, but it is powerful in the sense that like it's just going to last until the end of until your next turn. So the rest of the combatants can actually take part of it too. But here's the other thing: is like, well, do you only implement that system on the player side, or do you implement it on the players and the DM side? Because ultimately, it tends to affect the players far more than it's going to affect the monster per se, because they're there for a scene. The
Right.
players are there for the whole
So
campaign.
it depends upon what kind of effects that you're talking about. Page 272 of the DMG has lingering injuries. So if you wanted to have some things where the combat is a little bit more impactful, having lingering injuries affect the players, that's going to make the combat more interesting, because the party has to make wise choices as to what they're going to do if what the monster is doing to them could be more than, oh, well, I'll just cast a Cure Wounds spell and it goes away. So like there's elements to look at there. Whereas if you're looking for more exciting and heroic actions, then you could make it just be on the player side and treat the monsters as, per standard rules. And there it's going to be more exciting because these are heroes. They can do more. Or you could have it completely even keel, and you never know. The monster might roll well, and the party might not. So it becomes a landslide against them.
Yeah, I do like the idea that it happens on both sides of the screen. I think that is like, it's makes the outcomes a little less predictable. You don't know what's going to happen. Things are going to change on the fly. The wizard had planned on doing an action, so, they get crit by an arrow, and maybe you describe it as it just grazes them across the forehead, blinding them for a round, right? But for a spellcaster, it's a big deal because so many of your spells require you to target, right? So now they have to think, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? Because I've got blood in my eyes.
Yeah.
But I am not a fan of lingering injuries. I think I think it sucks. It's like, oh, okay. Like, and there's definitely games where, not only are there lingering injuries, but there's like insta kill. Like you get a critical in, I think it was like one of the original Middle Earth role playing games, and it's like you take an arrow through the ear and it instantly clears all earwax. Oh, and you're dead, right? So it's like, so to me, that's not a lot of fun. Spend a bunch of time building a character, and then like, oh well, I guess I'm gonna figure out how I'm a venturer with one arm now, or whatever. Like they're not really things that you probably signed on for. It's different if they kind of happen in the game, and I've been in games where stuff like that has happened, but like it's been like player driven decisions more so than like a random roll. It sucks when it's a random roll. So I do like the idea of like minor effect for, one round, or major effect for one round that's going to change the flow of combat, in addition to everything else that's going. And also too, like you get that major effect of, or even that minor effect of knock back, right? Well, if you're fighting on the edge of a cliff, like all of a sudden that minor effect becomes kind of major, in the outcome of the game. Yeah.
And that is one of the things that I like tactically, is when you have things, whether it be, the dice mechanic, spells, the tactics of, I'm going to push them into the water, I'm going to push them into the fire, I'm going to push them off a cliff. It greatly changes the scenario. But it also is like, well, if they have something I'm looking for, if they have treasure, I push them off a cliff, I'm not getting that thing. So like it you really do have to factor in whether that's a decision that you want to make. And it's a lot of fun, but it does make the game more interesting. It doesn't make it more exciting.
Yeah, so maybe like 17 and 18, a little bit extra damage. 19 is a little bit of extra damage plus the minor effect, and then the 20 is a standard crit, but then you add like the major effect to it too. And again, I would say you'd look at the conditions for deciding like what is the worst thing that could happen.
Sure.
Like deafening someone might be a minor effect, but in most cases it doesn't do a whole lot in the game. But maybe you've got someone trying to sneak up with them, so you choose that one because you won't have disadvantage to their perception checks that involve hearing.
Sure. I mean, you could do things where like, the wind is knocked out and their speed becomes 0. Attack rolls are going to be made at disadvantage. Stunning, as we brought up, is something major. If you're going to do something like that, I might impose a con save against that to just be like, oh, you stunned the bad guy. All right, well, that gives us a whole free round to just, lay womp on him. So I'm always very leery about the stunned condition against, a solo enemy.
Yeah, it can be tricky. Well, yeah, I mean, the saving throw thing might definitely be a thing to take into consideration. I mean, it's easy enough. It's an easy enough formula to work out. 8 plus proficiency modifier plus strength or dex if we're talking about attack rolls.
Right.
Or you can use your spell DC if you're using a spell that requires an attack roll. So this way our wizards and sorcerers and clerics and warlocks can get in on the fun as well.
Indeed. Now, I mean, we're talking about things to add on top of an already existing system, and it's meant to add that excitement in there. If it's not something that's, for you, that's fine. It's something that I would highly recommend either talking about during your session 0 or have a mini session 0 and discuss with your players whether this is something that you want to add to your table for a pre-existing game.
Yeah, and also it's just an example of cool ideas you can get from playing other role-playing games, and or even just tabletop games too. There might be some cool mechanic there. You're like, oh, this would work really good in my D&D game, and there's no reason why you can't just add it to your game.
Absolutely. Nerdarchy's always been a proponent of, take rules, take inspiration from wherever you see it, wherever you find it.
Let us know if you have any homebrew house rules that you've taken from other games, other RPGs, tabletop games, and inserted into your game, and share them with the Nerdarchy community down below in the comments.
While you're down there, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, even click that notification bell. You know the drill.
Quick reminder, Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, we drop new videos here on the channel, so come on back and see what's new. But hey, you can't wait till then. No worries, we got you covered. You can check out Move Over D&D. It's time for Cypher system from Monty Cook Games.
So until next time, stay nerdy.